Hello all, we're gonna give everybody a few seconds to just get in and get situated, and then we're gonna do our housekeeping slides, and we get to hear this fabulous session by Dr. Virginia OHara and Amberlee Venti. So hang tight for a couple seconds.
In case anyone was curious, I got over my panic attack at not being able to find the breakout room.
I think we threw everybody off. Everybody's like, where is it?
We're all in the same boat.
That makes two of us, yes.
We're sorry, y'all jumped the gun a little bit.
We didn't want to miss anything.
It was a working reminder to have faith, and it all worked out.
We need to find our peace. We're good.
Okay. So are there different breakout rooms?
There are. So right now there's 2 breakout rooms going on. This one's related to DBT and the other one is related to good grief with Reverend Naomi Leapart.
Okay. Either or, it doesn't matter for me.
Yeah, right. They're all great. I mean,
all of them, right.
We always land with a winner here.
What does DBT stand for? What's meant by DBT?
Oh, dialectical behavioral therapy.
And if you're wondering what's that, stay tuned. You'll find all of the answers to your questions and more.
We're going to give an overview of DBT in the presentation.
Sorry, I'm being bad at multitasking. So I am going to go ahead and do our housekeeping slide so I can give our presenters as much time as humanly possible because we desperately want to hear what it is they have to say. So hello, y'all, and welcome to the Faith and Spiritual Affairs Conference. Our session this morning is Dialectical Behavior Therapy, Cultivating Connections During a Global Pandemic. So your presenters today are Dr. Virginia OHara and Amberlee Venti. Dr. OHara is a DBT Linehan board certified clinician. She acts as a clinical associate professor and as the director of Jefferson Center City Clinic for Behavioral Medicine. A mouthful, right? She's super impressive. And presenting with her is Amberlee Venti. She is a licensed clinician and a board certified dance movement therapist. She currently works at Community Behavioral Health in the evidence-based Wow, how did I mess that one up? I used to work there, sorry. In the Evidence-Based Practice and Innovation Center, or EPIC, and is the Evidence-Based Practice Implementation Manager. So just a couple housekeeping slides before we get started, and then I will hand it over. One, we are probably going to mute all of you just so that folks can hear exactly what's going on. When we have different people talking and we can hear everybody's everything, it can be incredibly distracting. We want to be able to pay attention to the presenters. So that's one. We're going to mute our microphones unless otherwise asked to come off of mute. Also, a reminder, if you are using a computer, you're good to go. If you are using a phone or tablet, it may mess up some of the functionality for Zoom. Don't worry about it too much, but if we say you have something or some functionality and you don't have it, chances are it's because you are on a phone. I will be your moderator today. My name is Bree. If you have any issues or any problems, throw them in the chat and I will help you. If you have any questions for the presenters, please put them in the chat. We'll collect them. They'll be able to answer them either throughout or as we go along. And finally, we'll figure out how to get you all your PowerPoint and references so that you can look back on this. Just to let you know, the session is being recorded, and it's mostly because we have 2 sessions at the same time. So people who came to this one may want to see the other one and vice versa. So these will be made available so everybody can see them. In order to receive continuing education units, we need you to engage in all of the activities we have up, which is going to include Mentimeter, which is an app that we can all use and answer questions and polls through. Don't worry, we will tell you how to use it. At the end of this, we're going to have you complete a post test, and we're also going to have you complete an evaluation. The post test is fast. It's going to be really easy to get through. And the evaluation is also pretty quickly. Evaluation is just to tell us how the presenters did, what kind of training you'd like in the future. And it's also the only way we know how to give you whatever continuing education credits you need to get. So you must fill it out. And I'll repeat this again at the end, but I just want to let y'all know before we even sort of get started. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and I will hand it over to our wonderful presenters, Dr. OHara and Amberlee Venti.
Just give me 1 sec. I'm trying to find, I have my slides up, but I'm not seeing the share screen, sorry. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you can all see my slides now. Sorry for the wait. Once again, I'm Amberlee Venti, and this is Dr. Virginia OHara, and we are really excited to present to you about dialectical behavior therapy and cultivating connections during a global pandemic. I'm going to let Virginia go over her disclosures.
Sure, I have nothing to disclose other than the great intro that Bree already gave me. That's me. Hello. I guess just maybe sidebar, the Center City Clinic for Behavioral Medicine, you might have heard of previously. It was housed at Jefferson, at Drexel. And then we were able to move it intact, all the patients, all the clinicians, admin, staff, research staff, when Hahnemann went bankrupt and we were left kind of in limbo. So we landed at Jefferson in February 2020, and that's where we are. Same clinic, same name, just different location.
Ditto on Bree doing a fabulous job of presenting the alphabet soup that comes after my name. But I am an employee of community behavioral health at Epic. And I have a history of doing direct clinical care, predominantly with adults in the DBH-CBH system.
So Marsha Linehan, the treatment developer of dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, is very adamant in stating that the goal of DBT is to help people find the path to getting out of hell. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in just a few moments.
So the learning objectives today are really to start with looking at how the pandemic has distanced many of us from one another. And then talking about DBT, I know I already saw some excitement in the chat box about DBT and who it can help. So we're going to make sure that we give you a familiarity with this model. Then we're actually going to hear from, we're not going to physically hear from them, but we are going to read some slides about members who have received DBT and how it helped them to stay spiritually and socially connected during the pandemic. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you might apply similar principles to your own program. So a little overview is, I already said, talking about the challenges to connectedness during a global pandemic, a base overview of DBT, and then we're going to dive into DBT and talk about the principles within DBT that help spiritual connectedness and social connectedness. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of our department, the Evidence-Based Practice and Innovation Center at CBH, and how we support evidence-based practices, specifically DBT in the network. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we surveyed our DBT programs and how they use the model to keep people connected. And then Virginia is going to talk about how her programs specifically use the DBT model to facilitate spiritual and social connection. And lastly, we'll hear those testimonials.
Ooh. Okay, poll number 1. So, and this is going to happen, I think, via Mentimeter. So take a moment, look within, and think, to what extent has your own social connectivity been affected during the pandemic? And then how about your spiritual connection? To what extent has that been affected during the pandemic? And then after you've thought about that for a moment, switch gears and think about your clients or patients, and to what extent has their social and spiritual connection been affected by the pandemic? So you can click at the Menti link that was just put in the chat, and there's a code that goes with it. So we'll give you a moment or two to fill that out. Uh-oh, it's not allowing me to open it.
You can also drop into the chat. I see people being really resourceful and just dropping kind of the experience in the chat if you are comfortable, no pressure.
Oh, I love that idea. Like, forget the Menti and stick it in the chat.
It's a global pandemic. We have to be resourceful, right?
Yeah, it's a make it work moment. This is what DBT is all about. Radically accept. It's not happening. Let's find another way.
It's not letting me put the code in.
Jeez. Bree, are we allowed to keep it
I'm in
moving?
my phone and I'm trying to like copy paste it because it has another code and it doesn't let me at all delete it. So I could put the new one.
That is
You can
good.
just copy and paste it. It'll cover over it because I did the same thing.
That's okay. I'll go ahead and put responses in the chat. I know that some people are able to get into menti.com, so you can kind of look back and forth and see what everybody's responses are.
Nice.
Amberlee, can y'all see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I what?
Can we see this?
Oh, can we see your screen? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So those are some
I
of
see a lot of,
the
yep.
And this, a common theme from the chat is emerging, that clients became depressed. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that we as providers, a lot of us became a bit more hopeless, maybe clients too.
Mm-hmm.
Are we okay to keep it moving? What do you think?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for being so flexible and putting some, vulnerable thoughts and feelings in there for yourselves and your clients. I really appreciate it. Bree, I should reshare my screen. Yep.
yes, ma'am.
All right, got it.
It was just one question in that. Was that correct?
Yeah, just the one question. So some challenges to spiritual connection during the COVID pandemic. First of all, kind of physical challenge of places of worship being closed or going remote. I know a lot of the places of worship in my community, I live just outside of Philly, have had streaming options. But I know also there have been some that where people can gather in person, but in reduced numbers, or gather in person and sort of just kind of hope for the best. And then thinking about how holidays and other gatherings might look different. I know in my family, usually we have we host a kind of multi-family, like in-laws and outlaws dinner for Thanksgiving and also for Christmas. And all of that was essentially canceled for us. And I know for a lot of our patients, especially people who are kind of more vulnerable already to COVID and to long COVID, the holidays have looked quite different. And then challenges to social connectedness. So many venues, like typical venues for social connection, have been closed or limited. I know a lot of the parks and playgrounds have been shut down, especially for the first few months of COVID. And then thinking about the increased risk of COVID among certain populations, so among people of color, people living in poverty, or people without homes, are disproportionately at risk for not only COVID, contracting COVID, but then also having a bad outcome related to COVID. And then increased layoffs and unemployment, so there's less disposable income for socializing and travel to see family, that sort of thing. And then really vital means of connection might be limited because of access to technology and equipment. And it can also, the feeling of connection can also be impacted by whether you're seeing, your family on a small screen, like on a smartphone, versus on a larger screen, like a tablet or a laptop. And I think, we've all found a way to kind of make the best of it, but that's another sort of intersection where like low income can increase the sort of feeling of disconnection with family and friends during the pandemic. And then thinking about DBT as not a suicide prevention program. So we're going to learn a lot more about what DBT is in the next few moments. But a lot of times people think about DBT as a suicide prevention program, but really it's all about building a life worth living, building a life that's worth showing up for and jumping into with 2 feet. And I'm a really big fan of trying to help people figure out and trying to help ourselves figure out how we can build a life that's worth living during the pandemic. So kind of no matter what the world throws our way, there's still a way to build a life worth living. And that's what DBT can really help us all figure out. So DBT is an empirically supported treatment for chronic suicidality, for non-suicidal self-injury like cutting, burning, for borderline personality disorder, substance abuse, particularly opiate abuse, binge eating, for regulation of problematic anger and rage, and for many other impulsive behaviors. And really for any disorders that are related to pervasive emotional dysregulation. So kind of in a nutshell, any problematic behaviors that are kind of fueled by intense emotion or by efforts to kind of bring down intense emotion. So kind of a DBT in a nutshell, what the heck are dialectics is usually the question that I get. And Marsha Linehan, the treatment designer, has said that if she could make one change to this treatment, she would change the name to get rid of the D, to get rid of the confusion around dialectics. And she really wanted to call it Zen Behavior Therapy, so ZBT, but thought that that wouldn't get her tenure. And so came up with a more kind of academic sounding name, which unfortunately has served to kind of alienate quite a lot of people, because what the heck are dialectics? Whenever I ask that to my group of trainees, there's inevitably one person who is, some like private school educated person who gives me a big diatribe about dialectics. I'd honestly never heard of it until learning DBT in 2000. So apparently dialectics are 2 extremes that require a synthesis. So the central dialectic in DBT is full acceptance on the one hand of the hand that you've been dealt in life, and then on the other hand, full motivation to change what we can. So kind of both are true at the same time. You've been dealt a bad hand and you have the power to change some things. And then another really useful dialectic during the pandemic is you might not have caused all of your problems, like none of us have caused COVID. And at the same time, it's on us to solve this problem anyway. It's on us to find the best way to live with COVID. And I love the comment that just came through in the chat about focus on what you can control and then accepting what we can't. So that's just the perfect, that's DBT in a nutshell. Okay, what's next? So there are 4 components to comprehensive, or what we call full model DBT. So there's weekly individual therapy, that's about an hour, weekly skills group, that's about 2 hours long, and then there's consultation team that all of the DBT therapists attend weekly, and that's for an hour. And then there's phone coaching, where patients and clients can call us in their own lives for help generalizing skills, reducing, managing crises, and staying out of the hospital. And especially during the pandemic, and given the increased vulnerability that a lot of our low-income patients are at, and a lot of our patients who are people of color are at, to COVID, and honestly probably to not getting the best treatment in the hospital during a pandemic, our strong goal of DBT is keeping patients out of the hospital and finding a way that they can solve their crises with our help to prevent hospitalization. So the consultation team, this is the A team. I'm kind of revealing my age here, but if you don't know it, Google it. So it's like a weekly case conference for DBT providers, but it's more than that. So it's where we put ourselves on the agenda for kind of rating our burnout, rating our effectiveness. We observe judgments about, about ourselves and about our patients. And there's a strong emphasis on kind of holding compassion for the patient. And we make sure that we're not burning out. So what are some things we can do to observe our own limits? And at times, what can we do to extend our own limits? And we really rally together for this idea of like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it holds the therapist in the model to prevent drift away from the DBT model. And it's also sometimes thought of as therapy for the therapist. So, it's not uncommon for team to be a place where we talk about burdens from our life outside of work that could be interfering with our practice or just our lives. And then the skills group, there are 4 main modules, and we quickly moved. So a week before the city shut down, we moved to Zoom for all of our DBT skills groups. And that's partly because as our clinic mission for serving patients with chronic health conditions and concurrent psych issues, most of our patients, the vast majority, have some sort of chronic health issue that would put them at increased risk for having a problem with COVID. So we quickly moved to telehealth before the full shutdown happened. And Zoom, just this format is how we've been doing all of our groups for the past year and a bit. So there's four modules, 3 main ones. That's emotion regulation, dealing with emotions. So getting emotions into this kind of critical like bandwidth where they're useful. So where you're not so numbed out that you don't know what you're feeling, and emotions aren't so sky high that they're overwhelming. So kind of getting them into this like sweet spot where you can get good data from your emotions and use them to guide decisions. And then we've got interpersonal effectiveness, which is dealing with others, how to say no, how to observe your limits, how to ask for what you need. Distress tolerance, which is all about getting through a crisis without making things worse. And then mindfulness, which is typically a 2-week session in between each of these main modules, which are typically 8 weeks long. And mindfulness is all about one thing in the moment, present moment, so as not to get hijacked by emotions. So faith and spiritual connectedness is really central to DBT. So DBT has a strong link to Zen, with an emphasis on wise mind, which is this kind of like seat of intuition where this like gut feeling where you know what's right. Intuitive knowing is valued just as much as information from data. So for example, if a patient has like a bad feeling about something, we're never going to be ones to be like, oh, well, forget that, look at the data. It's like bad feeling is weighed just as heavily as check the facts and let's see, what we've got in terms of data. Connectedness and spirituality are really inherent to the DBT model. So there's no requirement for belief in a higher power for DBT. And at the same time, there's a lot of room for spirituality and higher power to coexist and to really be integral to this treatment. So the treatment developer, Marsha Linehan, is a Zen Roshi and a devout Catholic. And she has this really great account called In Her Own Words, which I'm going to read you the best part of it, but you can also Google it to get the whole story, where she talks about how her life was transformed. So she had been chronically suicidal, and she had had like hundreds of suicide attempts, including while inpatient at the hospital, doing anything she possibly could to try to end her life. And then she had this life-changing spiritual experience, which in her words took her out of hell. And then she realized that her mission was to create DBT to then go back to pull out the other people who were still trapped in this living hell of chronic suicidality. So here's her story, but really, Google it to hear the whole thing. So Marcia prayed often at a chapel in the Senecal Retreat Center. One night I was kneeling in there, looking up at the cross, and the whole place became gold. And suddenly I felt something coming toward me, she said. It was this shimmering experience. And I just ran back to my room and said, I love myself. It was the first time I remember talking to myself in the first person. I felt transformed. And this high lasted about a year before the feelings of devastation returned when she had a failed relationship. But something was different. Even in the aftermath of this failed relationship, she could weather her emotional storms without cutting or harming herself. Ooh, okay, poll 2. Seems a little familiar to poll 1. To what extent does the treatment or therapy that you do provide social connectivity or spiritual connectivity? Ever get the feeling of deja vu?
People
Do you
could
want to
just
give Mentimeter one more try, or do you want to just?
Okay.
Yeah, no, do it. Why not?
Sure.
Oh no, that was the first one we did.
I know, right?
Right.
Still good.
Keep it moving?
Keep it moving.
Okay.
Yeah, let's keep it moving. Hopefully I have the right slideshow up.
Dude, you can't use the microphone.
I'm reading what people are saying. Awesome.
No, sorry.
Great. It sounds like the treatments being used are providing both social and spiritual connection, which is really beautiful to see. It's great. Awesome. Should I send it to the next slide?
Okay, so specific DBT skills that support faith and spiritual connectedness. So there's prayer, which is the P from the improved distress tolerance skill. And there is a caveat, because I know that among some of our patients, patients have either had like a bad experience with their like religious upbringing, or have, are devout atheists. If that's the case, prayer can be to one's wise mind, again, that kind of seat of intuition where you know what's right, what's true. However, the vast majority of our patients will use prayer in terms of prayer to a higher power. And then willing hands, which is pictured here, which is kind of this like palms up, like relaxed palms up. I do this all the time during meetings, especially like annoying ones. Maybe you're doing it right now. So this is a really good skill for like radically accepting with the body. So it's kind of just being willing to take whatever is coming right now without judgment. Radical acceptance, which we keep talking about, which is like wholehearted acceptance of the present moment. And there are accounts of radical acceptance across different, different faiths, including, there's one that I wanted to kind of draw special attention to, which is Viktor Frankl's life-changing book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about how radical acceptance, wholehearted acceptance of not saying I love it or I condone it, but wholehearted acceptance of the situation that he was in a concentration camp during the Holocaust, allowed him to play by the rules, be lucky, survive, and be reunited with his family at the end, when many, many people died by running against the electric fence because the suffering was just too much. So radical acceptance is this idea of kind of, it is what it is. It doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean I like it. It's this wholehearted acceptance of the present moment. And sometimes that can kind of free us from suffering enough that we can survive the present moment. And then we've got mindfulness with its non-judgmental stance and overall goal of kind of connection with the universe, connection with everything around us. A lot of mindfulness practices involve like noticing nature, noticing things that help us to be calm and feel connected.
Thank you, Virginia. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about EPIC and what we do in the Evidence-Based Practice and Innovation Center at Community Behavioral Health. So evidence-based practices really started to be implemented in our system as part of our former commissioner, Dr. Arthur Evans' goal to have a recovery-oriented system and to really get away from a medical system where we were telling CBH members what treatments they needed to do, when, where, and how. It was really to bring a voice to CBH members and then also to give them quality and effective services and practices based in science and research. So a couple years before EPIC was established, there were, we specifically started with cognitive behavioral therapy and then implemented other evidence-based practices like dialectical behavior therapy, which we've been talking so much today about. And dialectical behavior therapy really started in 2012 to address individuals in our system who continue to show up in hospitals with suicide attempts or self-injury attempts, and to really support and help them through the best and most effective treatment, which was DBT. So in 2013, EPIC was established so that there was a hub to support the evidence-based practices already happening in the system. What we quickly realized after, which was that this was before I was at EPIC, but this is what I have heard, which is that when we trained providers and clinicians in evidence-based practices, we realized that they needed support after that. It wasn't, you can't just do a one and done, we've trained you, we've given you expert consultation, and then we say goodbye, good luck in the world implementing evidence-based practices. I'm sure many of you here on the Zoom call know that implementing any new practice in community behavioral health can be very hard. There's low resources, there's not a lot of time, there's often many regulations that can make things even harder to do. So that was really the concept of EPIC, is how do we support these practices to be delivered effectively? And so you can see there's 4 components that help us to strategically support evidence-based practices, which includes providing education and resources, supporting our evidence-based practice initiatives like dialectical behavior therapy, identifying key strategies for implementation. So often we work with our providers to hear how they've overcome barriers in their implementation. Virginia has given examples and will give some really great examples about specifically when the pandemic happened, how did they make sure that all the members could still receive DBT because they knew they needed it. So that's a really great example of identifying a successful strategy to keep people engaged in the model. And then lastly, aligning fiscal and operational policies to optimize practice impact. So in a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about our designation and what that means and how it helps to financially support programs who are delivering these programs. So these are initiatives in Philadelphia. We have the luck of having 3 out of 4 of these treatment developers being local to Philadelphia. There's many reasons why I love this city, but here's 3 more reasons why I love this city. I'm not going to talk about all of these at length, but you can see here we have many evidence-based practices that both target children and adults with different symptomology, different diagnoses, different presenting problems. But all of these were chosen strategically so that we could help all the members of our community and make sure that these practices were accessible to them. The only one that is not local to Philadelphia is actually Dr. Marsha Linehan, the creator of dialectical behavior therapy. So dialectical behavior therapy started in 2012. I talked a little bit about that, but really as a way to help individuals that were suffering from emotional regulation difficulties, self-injury, and suicide attempts, and impulsive symptomology. So we started in 2012 actually working with Marcia Linehan's team and training our clinicians in DBT. We then moved on to work with the Treatment Implementation Collaborative because they have a specialty in implementation. So as I spoke about before, it's not as easy as just one and done with training, especially with a model like DBT that has a lot of components to it, a lot of moving parts. It's really important that we focus on sustainability of the practice and how to implement in a community behavioral health setting. So TIC has been a really great partner in this and continues to support us and our programs in sustaining DBT in the system. So I'm going to just talk about this a little bit, but one thing that we have going on in EPIC is that we designate programs that are delivering quality evidence-based practices to CBH members in our community. So the EPIC designation was created for a couple reasons. Number one, to recognize programs delivering EBPs in a quality manner, but also number two, to recognize programs that trained in an EBP and implemented an EBP outside the auspices of CBH DBH. So we have a lot of awesome programs, and actually Virginia's program is one of these, who use their own resources and time to seek out an evidence-based practice, get trained in it, train clinicians in it, and implement it in their program. So the designation at the end of this presentation, we'll have some links to where you can go to learn more about it. But basically, it really asks all the components of your EBP program, including how referrals come in, how EBPs are documented, how you can tell that members are getting better from it through treatment outcomes, and so on. And if it's filled out and we see that you're delivering EBPs in a quality manner, you can become a EPIC designated program and get our seal of approval. And then also we offer, as part of the designation, an enhanced rate for outpatient and outpatient mental health and substance use programs. You can also see here that we have 85 designated programs, which is really great. So we have about 15 DBT programs, designated and non-designated, in our system. And when I first saw the call for this conference and about how people are staying spiritually and socially connected during the pandemic, I first thought of DBT. That was the first thing that came to my mind. The second thought that came to my mind was a paper that Virginia recently wrote about her specific program and how she really trucked on, woke up every day and made sure that DBT kept happening and kept CBH members and then also DBT clinicians connected during such a chaotic and scary time. So what I wanted to do is to survey our providers to get to see if this thought was correct and really get a sense of how DBT really fosters these connections. So we sent out a survey to our providers where we asked them, number one, how did they continue to implement DBT? We knew that with a global pandemic happening and in-person services being almost impossible, especially in the beginning, that implementation was affected. And what we found, which is really great, actually, I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm moving ahead of myself, excuse me. We also asked about how they did DBT via telehealth, how the model was kind of affected by that, either whether it was enhanced or there was some barriers in it. We asked how DBT kept consumers connected, and then how it helped them to cue into their own spirituality and faith during such a scary time. And then lastly, how reducing isolation. So what we found, this is where I was getting ahead of myself, is that all of our providers moved to telehealth. So, you know, we know that for some of our providers, at first it just started with audio calls because that's the technology that they and the CBH members had. We know that many of them progress to video telehealth platforms like Zoom or other HIPAA protected platforms. And then we also found that our residential providers that didn't have the choice of doing telehealth, that they continue to do DBT groups, but to take safety precautions. So that might have looked like having smaller group sizes, doing group therapy actually maybe just with an individual. So using the group skills that Virginia was talking about, but just doing it with one-on-one. And what we were also really excited to see was there was more successes than barriers. In true DBT fashion, our DBT programs moved through those barriers and enhanced the programming that they already had via telehealth. So we saw a lot of increased engagement and attendance. So if you think about telehealth, you know, I'm sure many of you have had telehealth appointments during the pandemic. As a mom of two, I am much more likely to show up to a telehealth appointment because I do not have to find childcare. I don't have to jump in my car in the middle of Center City traffic to get somewhere. There is a lot of reasons why telehealth is just much more accessible. We saw a lot of increased interaction outside of group. So group kind of helped to solidify relationships that were forming in DBT groups, and it made it easy for members to either text or call each other outside of group. What we found, and I heard a lot from our providers, is that DBT members who were often quiet in person were actually more vocal via Zoom. So if you think about, it can be a little bit easier to drop something in the chat than verbally say it. So we saw a lot of that. And then, like I said before, the barriers of commuting to an appointment kind of made it for quicker engagement. So getting people in DBT quicker. And then the barriers are really what you could expect. So technology, I mean, we've already had a technological difficulty today. So it's totally human, and technology continues to be hard. So it used to be that our programs would physically hand handouts and worksheets, DBT handouts and worksheets to members. Obviously that can't be done. So a lot of moving around that, trying to email it to them, maybe drop it off at their house, keeping individuals on camera during group, and then a lot of trouble engaging teens we saw. So here's some of our survey themes continued. We heard from members that they did feel less isolated. They felt DBT was a safe space to connect during all sorts of political turmoil, racial trauma that was being, you know, blasted in people's ears and faces throughout the pandemic. DBT skills helped individuals to regulate their emotions. There was a break in monotony. I know it feels like Groundhog's Day during this pandemic. We wake up every day, we do the same thing every day. So what a great thing to look forward to, a DBT group or session. Increased rapport, I already talked a little bit about this. Small talk before and after group to help connection, people meeting up outside group, and creating a sense of normalcy during chaotic times. I really like that one because nothing really feels normal right now. And then, so as I suspected, DBT also helped clinicians really feel connected. Virginia talked about the consultation team. So that's a weekly activity that clinicians could look forward to, where they're going to support one another, talk about their burnout, do therapy for the therapist so that they can, you know, continue to move on, and so that they can support our DBT members. Doing mindfulness practices together, helping bonding, adjusting to all the work-life changes. You know, that means having kids bomb your Zoom, having dogs bomb your Zoom, all sorts of things like that that we're all still continuing to get used to. And then holding each other accountable is a really great aspect of team. And then also, as I suspected, DBT has really helped to foster spirituality in individuals. I think Virginia did a great job of talking about, you know, you don't have to be one specific religion in order to engage in the spiritual aspect of DBT. It's a really open practice where individuals can engage in a way that makes them feel comfortable and fosters their own faith. Are you writing me a message?
No, I was writing to everyone.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Showed up on cue.
What?
He showed up on cue.
I know, right?
You can see some of the DBT interventions here that Virginia's already talked about a little bit, but this is really just validating that these helped individuals to cue into these religious practices. Here is a lovely word cloud of the themes that came up throughout the survey.
Okay, in their own words. So I was super excited that 3 of our members, and quite often I'll use the language patients because I'm working within the Jefferson hospital system, and I've kind of like grown up on like doing therapy within a hospital system, but you know, clients, members, patients, I'm sort of using those interchangeably. So 3 members offered to share their experience of DBT in our program. And we asked them, how, if at all, does DBT enhance your connection, social and spiritual, and what DBT skills help with your spiritual connections, particularly during the pandemic? So here's who volunteered. First, there's Dwayne. He's a 35-year-old African-American male, and he's a musician and a restaurant worker and a recovery house manager. And he's been in DBT for about 14 months. He's since graduated, woo, and he also attends this DBT deep dive, which we'll hear more about in a couple moments, but spoiler alert, it's like an additional group that was launched during the pandemic. That's optional. So he said he really looks forward to his DBT group. It helps with stress, and he's made friends in the group. He is actually the host of this DBT waffle chat, which is like a Facebook group just for members of this DBT group, where they could just kind of talk about anything. And he said it's such a blessing that we kept deep dive going after the first wave of the pandemic. So let me tell you about it now, just to kind of have more continuity here. So Deep Dive was this group that was launched when the pandemic started, an additional hour on Fridays, all over Zoom, totally optional, doesn't count towards 4 misses, which is one of the DBT rules, just completely optional, where we would apply specific DBT skills for tolerating the pandemic. So kind of adjusting to this like harsh reality of the new normal, a lot of skills from distress tolerance. And then that, at the request of the patients, that group kept going after the kind of initial hurdle of adjusting the pandemic had passed, and it became this kind of deep dive where we take one DBT skill that we might not be able to have a lot of airtime for during the big group. Like, for example, there's this really cool nightmare protocol for if you're having nightmares that could be like trauma triggers. And we wouldn't typically get to spend a lot of time on that during the big group, but we might spend a whole deep dive or a couple of deep dives on that. So he loved that. And then he said music is a spiritual experience for him. The majority of friends that he's made have been through music, his band, guys he's known for 10 years. Making and releasing songs, knowing I did this is one of his life worth living goals. And then his favorite skills were are mindfulness, tip, and he said at work he'll go into the walk-in freezer to kind of experience the like cold of, you know, being in the walk-in freezer. He said you go there to center, meditate, say a prayer. And the 12 steps of AA, he was talking about how DBT skills really help him to maintain his sobriety and work well with the 12 steps of AA. TIP is it's his acronym for, the T is for temperature. So it's kind of like if your emotions are really high, like 100 out of 100, you can like put your face in a bowl of ice or hold ice, or plug your sink and put your face that your nose and mouth are underwater for like 30 seconds. And this will create this dive response that slows your heart rate down. 15 minutes left. Okay. I is intense exercise, do like 10 jumping jacks. P is paced breathing or progressive muscle relaxation. Google it. You see there's tip handouts everywhere. Next time Amberlee is talking, I'll put one in the chat. So Rosetta, she's 31 years old, Black female, and she's a professional student with a long history of interpersonal relationship problems. She's been in the program for 6 months, although she also just graduated after about 8 months. Also comes to Deep Dive. And she said that DBT makes her less afraid of talking to people on the street. I've learned to smile at strangers, make small talk. DBT helps me let go of judgments. about whether what I said was the wrong thing. Recently asked a fellow dog walker if she wants to meet up with me in the park. She did. DBT helps me realize what my needs were. DBT also helped her dump some loser boyfriend, which has also happened since she gave this speech. And then she said that she experiences mindfulness as a spiritual connection. DBT enhanced this. I don't feel totally alone when I'm alone. And being attuned with myself, my surroundings through mindfulness helps with distress tolerance when I'm alone. I also feel a spiritual connection with others through mindfulness, and I'm more empathetic with myself and more forgiving of others. Inner peace exists for me. I didn't think that was possible. And she likes mindfulness, grounding, and distress tolerance. And then next up we have Kayla. So they're a 24-year-old non-binary Caucasian. They're a peer counselor. And they're living with autism, borderline personality disorder, and autoimmune disease. And they've been in comprehensive DBT for just over 2 months, also goes to the deep dive. And they talked about how DBT is the only form of therapy that's ever worked for them. They're so grateful it's accessible via Zoom. Going somewhere in person was a major barrier, even pre-pandemic, because of their autism and agoraphobia. Also because of transportation costs and financial problems. They've been told their whole life that accommodations weren't possible for them, and they're getting so much more out of the virtual DBT group. They can be mindful of their space and sensory needs. Often they're wrapped in like a weighted blanket that looks like a burrito. It's so great. They can mute the sound temporarily if they're getting triggered by what someone's saying, or even by like someone's like vocal tone or like additional sounds that could be triggering. At the start of the pandemic, they were having spiritual delusions. So they felt under spiritual attack, and they've been on a faith spirituality journey during the pandemic. They sought DBT. It helps them to engage with spirituality without feeling scared. They now have a belief in a higher power, which they didn't have prior to the pandemic. And they went from an anxious attachment with their higher power to a secure one, saying, I feel less scared to engage with it and more conscious and less delusional. And their favorite skills are mindfulness. When I'm mindful, I'm less delusional. Check the facts, apply to their faith, to their emotional response, spiritual response, and physical sensations, and tip for bringing themselves back to their body. So now we'll talk about my program here at Jefferson, and it's 100% telehealth right now. So all members, right when the pandemic hit, everyone had access to a device, which is great, because that was really my worry, was that there were going to be people who, because we serve a lot of low-income patients, that there'd be people who just didn't have a device, but everyone had something, whether they were borrowing a tablet from a family member or using a smartphone or whatever. Somehow everyone had something, which is a great miracle. We took time to orient people to Zoom. We launched that deep dive that we talked about. And we also had a rule that no one has to graduate during the pandemic. So people have chosen to graduate, but they can stay on in the deep dive, but no one has to leave the program during the pandemic. We had a weekly validation and venting group in the beginning for other therapists, for our DBT therapists. We've taken a communal approach to note-taking. So there's a teacher leader and a co-leader, and then observers, and the observers will also take part in writing notes. And I see the question, yeah, older people too. Everyone kind of found a way to get it together. Like this was just, I wasn't ready for that to move so smoothly, but yes, people of all ages found a way to get it together. And partly, the therapist spent time like orienting them to Zoom. And then our team was really burned out at the beginning. And I actually was part of the problem because I had no empathy for that. I felt like this is the time that we need to pull it together and help our patients. And that's how I personally derive a lot of meaning. And then my team was a lot of Gen X or whatever comes, no, I'm Gen X, whatever comes after millennial, like Gen Z or whatever that is. And they were kind of like, I shouldn't have to work during the pandemic. And burnout was high. I was not very validating of this approach. And so to kind of reset everything, we had Gizmo, the party goat, who is pictured here with me doing goat yoga several years ago in LA. So Gizmo, the party goat, came via Zoom to improve our team's morale. And I worked on my non-judgmental stance towards people wanting to kind of get some more support to be able to work to serve their patients during the pandemic. And after maybe a couple months, we all pulled it together and found a working model that's been working for us for about the past year. And then I also wanted to leave you with so I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a second DBT. RODBT, Radically Open Dialectical Behavior Therapy. It's a relatively new treatment, although it's not new in England and Europe. It's been around for about 20 years, and it's for disorders of over control. So you think about standard DBT for under control, like people who are like, it's hard to contain their emotions. So radically open DBT is more like for people who, think like uptight person who can't have a partner because they're just too rigid. So for treatment-resistant depression, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, anorexia, emotional loneliness. So just like regular DBT, there's 4 components. We currently have the only one in Philly, the only program in Philly. And if you're ready to move on to the next slide. Yep. Beep. Thanks. So it focuses on fostering connection, intimacy, closeness, getting silly, getting wacky, loosening up a bit. It's such a fun therapy to both deliver as the therapist and to receive as the patient. And it's all about increasing intimacy and vulnerability and connection with others.
If you want to learn, were you done, Virginia? I'm sorry.
No, I'm doner than done. Yeah.
So here we have the links. I already see that I'm pretty sure Bree, a former member of EPIC, dropped in the EPIC website. We also have a link here for the DBT Ask for It by Name flyer, which is put together by our communications team and Emily Schaefer, our awesome operations specialist. But this flyer, just to give you a little note about it, it's a really good way to, if you know somebody that maybe could benefit from DBT, it's a really good thing to hand them. It's like an advertisement for DBT. It's a great marketing device. We're really trying to work on how we market EBPs to the community. Like Virginia said before, not everybody knows what dialectics is. I also didn't know what that meant until I was introduced to DBT. So we like to make our EBPs more friendly to everyone and share it. So we're trying to do that through flyers like this. So please share. It's also on our website. This is also the portion of our website that can give you more information about the designation. There's a quick little like webinar about the designation. There's also, you can see a blank copy of the application. You can also see who is designated. So if you're looking for a quality program to send somebody, we have a list of all our designated programs up there. And I don't know if this is when the post test happens, but hopefully you learned a little bit about DBT and how it helps people stay connected and spiritually involved, and the different parts that actually facilitate those things. Hopefully you understand how it might feel for somebody receiving the treatment and how it might help them, and then how you can do that with individuals you're working with. And here's some recommended reading for all your time during the pandemic.
First one, The Building a Life Worth Living. It's a memoir. It's great. It's very readable. It's fast. It's really a good deep dive into the spirit of DBT, and it tells Marsha's whole story of her spiritual revelation.
We'll check out the, yep. I see some drops in the chat of our website. Yeah, I think that might be it.
Is that all she wrote?
That's all she wrote.
All right. So as